most of you know who I am. And I run a little nursery called Honey Petal Plants, and I am a very proud member of the Belfast Garden Club. And we're going to talk about some things today in relationship to some of the books that we brought into the library this year, namely biodiversity and everything that that might mean. And I'm kind of curious if all of you who are here have a sense of what that means to you already, or if it's something that you don't know much about and you'd like to learn more about. Does anyone want to share?
I'll share.
Okay.
This is totally, we did not rehearse this at all. So one of the books that we purchased was called Farming with the Wild. And I'm thinking biodiversity, I am not going to be biodiverse until I start seeing more snakes and frogs in my yard. And I think that, I feel like that's unusual because most people think, oh, I have native plants, so I'm biodiverse. But having gone through that book, I want to bring more creatures into my garden to make it more biodiverse.
Yeah. Interestingly, I used to live in the eco village, and one of the things that disturbed me about that place was the lack of amphibians there, and reptiles. I mean, they were probably in the woods. I didn't spend much time in the woods, but when I lived in upstate New York, you know, we had an explosion of toads every year, lots of snakes, both in and outside of the house. So even though snakes creep me out, I do see their value in the landscape. And I was so excited when we moved across town because I saw some toads in my yard.
Anyone else right now? We can talk more about it as we go along. But so for me, I am this is the 4th summer on this property, I think, 4th or 5th, 4th, I think. The people who had this property before were avid gardeners. However, they used a lot of chemicals, some of which they left here when they sold the house to us. So I know that they were doing that, and I do not do any of that. For the first year, for the first couple of years, I would see a salamander once in a while, but the amphibian population on my property has definitely increased, and I think it is due to the fact that I do not use insecticides and pesticides and herbicides. I was thrilled too to find, as a byproduct of having the nursery on my property, because I don't have like a little pond or anything yet, and it's kind of amazing. Even the smallest amount of water or a water feature can really up your attractiveness for all kinds of creatures, dragonflies, frogs, salamanders, birds. So if there's one thing that I could recommend that people do, is even in the smallest yard, have some kind of water feature that attracts insects, and then everybody else will also come. And that could be as small as like a half barrel without holes in the bottom, but that has some graduated rocks or a little ramp in case somebody falls in, they can get out. And a few plants in it, and maybe even like a little bubbler. And those are relatively inexpensive, just so the water is moving a little bit. And 2 things happen then. One is mosquitoes don't lay eggs in it, which a lot of people are concerned about. And there are other ways to prevent that from happening too, by like using these little Bacillus thuringiensis dunks. But if you have a little bubbler, then they don't lay eggs in moving water. And that you will see a lot of creatures attracted by that little spot and coming to your yard. It's very fun. And even just me having water in trays when I'm watering a bunch of perennials all at once, that totally upped my amphibian game. I had a lot more frogs last year.
So what about bird baths?
Well, a bird bath is useful for a bird, but it's a
But
little
not
bit,
necessarily to attract, because mine are on the ground. So
yeah.
amphibians could get in them.
Yeah, no, I think Margaret, I think that those little bits of water like that are absolutely wonderful. And I do think that you probably would attract many different kinds of things because they're on the ground that you wouldn't if it was on a stand. Absolutely. I mean, have you noticed that? What do you notice in your yard?
I haven't noticed amphibians, no.
Okay.
Dragonflies, yes, but not amphibians, yeah.
Mary, what did you want to say?
I wanted to add that last year on Amazon, we bought for 20, 30 bucks a solar fountain that floated around in a dish. And
Cool.
it worked like a charm. You can have all different kinds of sprays, and for 30 bucks, it was well worth it to keep that water moving. And if it just floats in very little, like an inch of water is all that it needs.
Yeah, it sounds pretty too, I bet. Just the moving water sounds really pretty. So there are a couple books specifically I want to talk about, but I wanted just to start by showing you this, which is actually one of the children's books that we bought, A Big Garden. And I don't know if any of you have seen it yet at the library, but even if you're not going to take it out and share it with your grandkids or anything, or read it yourself, because it's pretty amazing. I'm just going to show one picture in it just for fun. There are things that I don't like about this book, but the illustrations completely trumped any misgivings I had. One of them is that the author uses the pronoun he instead of they, which it just seemed it could have been so easy to use they. And if I ever read it to anybody, I would replace he with they. I'm just like, you've got to be kidding me. But the illustrations are amazing. And they are what I would say is sort of a quintessential representation of biodiversity from the standpoint of just being fecund, filled with life, filled with activity, and not just activity related to nature, like a pristine area that is devoid of anything related to humans. Like, one thing about biodiversity that is often, I think, misunderstood is that it includes people. We get to be included because we live here too. And so there's a lot of shame around being a human because we have totally massively screwed everything up so much. But that is an opportunity, not a long-term detriment to the world. So anyway, this is great. Definitely check it out. It's so much fun. I mean, you could look at one of the pictures for hours. It's very enjoyable and filled with a lot of humor. Mary, did you have anything you wanted to add at this point?
Nope.
Okay. So the other book I really wanted to focus on was this one, Nature's Best Hope by Doug Talmy. Now, Doug Talmy isn't the only person that writes about biodiversity, although you might think he is because of how much press he gets. And I like the guy a lot. I have Bringing Nature Home. And if you have that book, you have most of what is in here. You have it, it's updated for sure. And especially updated with the most recent research, which often appears in Bringing Nature Home as kind of, he is using his science brain to extrapolate some things that have actually now been studied more. For example, issues around whether or not you want to plant a straight species native plant versus planting a cultivar of a native plant. And so studies have been done to show us that often cultivars or native plants are just fine unless they have leaves that are not green, or unless the texture of their leaf has been significantly altered so that a caterpillar doesn't want to eat it. Like, for example, disease-resistant monardas often have very leathery leaves, and that's to help fight against powdery mildew, which is of course the bane of Monardas. It goes together like peanut butter and jelly, Monardas and powdery mildew. So there are a few things about cultivars that make them problematic for supporting the baby insects that we need to support. But if you have Bringing Nature Home, I wouldn't necessarily say you need to buy this book, although it does have a lot of good qualities to it, and I did learn things reading it. And it has some good thoughts about how, like, I think there's a lot of despair right now because it feels wherever you turn, the problems seem really big and insurmountable. And like, what can I possibly do on my own landscape or in my own little world to solve these to help solve these problems? And what he discusses in Nature's Best Hope is this idea of a homegrown national park. So we have a lot of privately held land in the United States. And if all of those people that privately held land started to make changes on their properties, not waiting for municipalities to, do what they should be doing on roadside verges, or not waiting for statewide initiatives or federal initiatives, but actually just did what they could do on their own land, and all of that were added up, it would be significantly larger than the amount of land that we have in conservation. And actually having land in conservation is often not enough to solve the problems that we have, because the land has been so degraded over time. So we almost have to think like gardeners, who of course, gardeners love plants. They want to put more plants in their landscape. We need to up the planting significantly, even if in nature, it doesn't quite work that way. So we almost have to think about pendulum swinging and not just leave it alone, although leaving it alone can be a really good first step, which we can talk about, but really, really plant more richly. And that's where gardeners come in. Yes, Mary.
So the Dan Jaffe quickie 20-minute video that we sent out to this group,
Yeah.
picked Monarda as and geranium was interesting too, but that the native Monarda supported, like, I want to say 8 different types of insects, and the other one was 2. I might have that wrong, but so when you talk about planting, I just wanted to take a shout out that what you plant can make a difference too, and just to be cognizant of that as well.
Absolutely. And it's a really good point too. Although I want to say that there is a little bit of a formula right now, again, developed because of studies that have occurred, where, for example, you can have some of your cake and eat it too. You maybe can't have the entire cake, but you can have some of it. So 70% straight native species to 30% what I call nice visitors from away, but we could think about that as plants that have been hybridized or cultivated or do not show up naturally in our part of the world, right? But that also do not exhibit invasive tendencies, because that's a whole other issue. Yeah, Pat.
One of the things that I am often telling people is that when you are in a new space, it's not just what you add, it's what you remove that can make a difference. Because, I mean, right now, oak trees and black cherry trees are hated varieties of trees because of the brown-tailed moth. Everybody wants to cut them down and burn them up. And both of those trees are really very important habitat trees. So before you remove something native, it's worthwhile to consider its habitat value and consider whether you really need it to be gone. I mean, there are reasons to remove trees. I'm not saying I just cut a whole bunch of dead things down in my yard, but even leaving a dead tree standing, if it's not in a dangerous place, is a real habitat improvement that costs nothing. So, and you can get some great woodpecker action on those trees.
It's a really good point. There's a couple things about that. One is the fact that oak trees are keystone species in our particular ecoregion, right? So one of the things, there are sort of, I think, hold on, let me find my notes. Talmy, at the end of his book, at the end of this recent book, page 205 to 211, there's a list of 10 things that your basic homeowner can do to up the biodiversity of their landscape. And one of them is to plant keystone genera. So for example, oaks, willows, and goldenrods in our ecoregion, right? So that it's going to change. Those keystone genera are different depending on where you live. But those are three very, first of all, they're common ecoregion plants for us, and they support a very large number of larvae. So that is why they are called keystone species. There are other things you can do that are more geared toward what we would call specialist insects. So there are specialist insects that will only feed on a particular thing. And of course, you know, the poster child for that is monarch and the monarch caterpillar, because they have been, they only feed on milkweed, and they've developed that relationship with milkweed over thousands of years. So there isn't anything that is going to replace milkweed in order to support that particular insect. But the low-hanging fruit is something like goldenrods, and there are a number of them, and even many of the cultivars are very good pollinator plants. And so when in doubt, plant a goldenrod. Actually, when in doubt, frankly, put anything in the ground, because anything that you plant in the ground, of course, unless it's invasive, will sequester carbon. And that is the thing we need to be doing all of the time. So sometimes I have conversations with people and they say, oh, Astrid, I wish I had more room in my yard. And I'm standing there and I'm looking at their yard, and I'm looking at their garden beds, and I'm looking at 2 or 3 feet of mulch around every single plant in their bed. And I'm thinking, you have plenty of room. You just don't know what to put there. And so ground covers can be our friends when we're trying to up pollinator habitat value and sequester more carbon, and also create planting communities that benefit every single other plant that's growing in our garden bed. Things like carexes and barren strawberry and low growing ferns, and even things that aren't native, like Phlox stolonifera and Phlox divaricata. Those are native further south of us. They're perfectly wonderful garden plants to grow here and will cause no problem to other native plants. So there are a lot of ground covers, and ground covers are your friend. If you feel like your garden is just too full of things, under every shrub, bush, and large growing perennial, you can put a ground cover. Yeah, Mary.
So one thing I want to add more to my garden is grasses, because they're so different than all those other phloxes and monardas, all those other 3-foot perennials with kind of the same leaf except for a daylily. One of the books we purchased, Modern Cottage Garden, a shout out to that, where it's adding grasses from a design. If you want it like me, well, I want to add them, but I need ideas of where to put them. That book is good, but I wanted to ask, what's the difference between a sedge and a grass?
So So this is a setup. Mary told me she was going to ask this question, so I did do a little research so I could properly answer it. First of all, grasses are so great. Grasses, sedges, rushes, they're all great depending on, because there's one for every niche. In other words, there's a lot of us have been kind of brought up thinking that all garden beds need to be the same. They all need to be sort of squishy, wonderful loam that we, have worked over and put a bunch of compost in and stuff like that. And what's great about native plants, plants that are native to a region, is they are adapted to different types of areas, different kinds of dirt, different kinds of moisture needs, different kinds of weather needs. So the grass family, the sedge family, and the rush family all have possibilities to go in somebody's landscape. They also are different kinds of texture, and in particular, they offer other kinds of shelter that our basic perennials don't offer, and sources of food, like calyxes in particular, are very high value food sources for larvae. So the difference between the three, they're all in three different families of plants, first of all. So even though they kind of look the same, we might say a lot of them are sort of grassy looking. They grasses in general have hollow stems. So that is one way to tell the difference between a grass, a rush, and a sedge. Sedges have edges. That's a nice little term you can remember, meaning that they're more flat, they're not rounded, and often they're actually tri-cornered if you look at them. So there's a lot of good information online, and if you want to really delve into the difference between grass, sedge, and rush, the place to go is minnesotawildflowers.info. They have a good set of pictures and a good explanation of each one of those things. Grass, sedge, and it's really grass, sedge, and rush. Sedges and calyxes are in the same family, and that's a very big family. Grass is also a very big family. Rushes are a slightly smaller family. So sedges have an angular stem. Sedges have edges. A round stem that isn't hollow is likely a rush, and a hollow stem is likely a grass. So that's how much we're going to delve into that right now. Yes, Mary?
Go ahead, Pat.
I know a little poem to remember this.
Oh, good.
Sedges have edges. Rushes are round. Grasses are hollow. So what have you found?
Oh, I love that. That's perfect. Yeah. That's actually a much more economical way to describe what I just said in a few minutes.
So I was wondering how aggressive, if I do put those grasses in, the blue stem seems to be pretty well behaved, but I have it surrounded by rocks as a mulch. How is it going to are they going to be garden thugs if you start planting those?
So it's hard for me to say one way or another. I would say it depends. So for example, some of the grasses, when they are put in a garden bed situation that has a higher level of nitrogen, they are going to, number one, grow in a way that they won't look attractive after a while, because they will have floppy kind of junk food growth in a way, because they're getting too much nitrogen, more than they're used to. They're taking advantage of that. So they grow really fast and they grow really big. And then the first rain, they're like flopping over and looking like heck. So what you want to do is, when you are interested in putting a grass or a sedge or a rush in a situation, is to research the plants and research the conditions. For example, a lot of people have a low and damp area on their property that they think they can't grow anything in. And there's actually a wonderful suite of plants that will grow there. And many of the rushes will grow really well there and prefer some water, even standing water. And then you can also add some of the bushes like buttonbush, and you can add some swamp milkweed, and you know, there are a lot of things that actually would much prefer that kind of area and will grow better than in a standard garden bed. There are a lot of carexes that love dry shade, and dry shade, of course, is a huge, you know, dry shade. What can I grow in dry shade? Well, there's actually many things you can grow in dry shade, and there are many carexes that are perfectly happy in dry shade. Hey, Margaret, did you have your hand up?
My husband in graduate school studied grasses and sedges and whatnot. And he wanted to add something about
Oh,
it.
excellent. Okay.
This is Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Chris.
I like what you're saying about biodiversity and what people can do on their own land and make good choices for the rest of biodiversity, not just ourselves. But when I taught plant systematics at the University of Maine, you got no credit for sedges have edges, rushes are round,
I bet.
grasses are hollow right down to the ground, because it doesn't work a lot of the time.
Right.
There's just no really short, easy way to distinguish these three families, but they're very easy to distinguish if you look at the right things in the flowering parts. And
Which are tiny.
yeah, they're small, but
No, but it's great that you're bringing that up. And that is actually why I directed people to the minnesotawildflowers.info site, because they go into much greater detail about how to identify specifically. And then also they take the whole sedge family and break it down into 4 different families as well, to, you know, to clarify that, because it's very complex. And it's really, I took a class about identifying sedges, and it was overwhelming. I mean,
well,
the
it's
guy
actually simple. It's complex because
Okay.
there's a lot of diversity, but people are afraid of small structures. But
Right.
the structures and understand how they're put together. In 10 minutes, I can tell people how to distinguish those 3 families.
Right, but then to identify a specific carex one from another,
Oh, yeah,
that is a little bit.
We have 150 species in
Yeah,
Maine.
exactly.
So it's big that way.
Yeah, that's what I found
That
daunting.
takes some time. But
Thanks for those
I like the
points.
blue stems. I worked on the blue stems for a PhD, Mary, and you know, not the same. You have a blue stem grass, there's a blue stem sedge too, but anyway, you know, wonderful plants. Anyway, keep going. You're doing a great
Yeah.
job.
He's listening.
Oh, Marge, you have your hand up.
What's the definition of a carex? I don't know that term. A general family or a carex?
So,
You're saying carex?
Carexes are part of the sedge family, and that is
Okay.
I think I'm pronouncing this incorrectly. My Latin is not always good, but Cyperaceae family. Cyperaceae. So when we talk about ground covers a lot in the native plant nursery field, a lot of the things that we talk about are carexes, like Carex pennsylvanica, you might have heard of, for example, or Carex stricta. There's a lot of them, and they have there are a lot of ways that you can use them in your landscape, because some of, you know, they're either nice little tufts that can grow well in a kind of tapestry under larger growing plants, or they're rhizomatic, meaning that you can use them to create a kind of feeling that you might get from a lawn. You not necessarily are recreating a lawn, but let's say you want an area that is low growing with a kind of pattern in it. Carexes often work really well in that kind of situation to either I mean, one way to think about it would be, and one of the recommendations that Talmy has is to think about ways that we can reduce lawn, because lawn tends to not be so great as far as its support of other creatures, right? It's good for us. We want an open space to lay a blanket down or to play frisbee, or for our dog to run around or our kids to run around. But so there are ways, though, to keep that open feeling, but also up some of the biological value. And one way is to do edge work with lower growing species. And for example, carex would be one of those, or violets, or wild strawberry, all of those kinds of cool things.
Got it. Okay. Thanks.
Hey, Barb, I see you.
Thank you. I too was wondering, Marge, so I'm glad you asked. I'm not familiar with that term. Could you both spell it and give some examples just in common name terms?
Oh, like CAREX.
EX.
And it's
okay.
often the first part of the binomial scientific name for certain kinds of plants in the sedge family. So they look grassy.
Sedges.
Okay. And I don't have my native plant list in front of me. Otherwise, I would rattle off a bunch of names for you of native carexes.
But basically, they're sedges of one type or another, but not all sedges are carex?
Correct. They're part of the sedge family.
Thank you. Helpful.
Hi, Margaret.
So I bought a number of K-Rexes from you, and they're doing really well. And it's a hard area where I planted them because it's a raised area and it has some big trees in it. So it's very dry and they're doing fine. So thank you.
Glad to hear it. And there's a lot of cool things. There are, I mean, dry shade is really interesting. Shade in general is interesting, right? Because we often just say shade, right? Full sun is full sun. Like there's a clarity to that. Shade is way more complicated. And often people have more light in their shade than they realize because light is cumulative. The plants, it's not like they need to be blasted with light. They need to get light. And often with like a moving canopy of high growing trees, you're getting quite a bit of light onto your plants. And you can grow more underneath in that kind of situation than you realize. That's just a little aside about shade because I just love shade. Does anyone else have, I wanted to go over these, this list of Talmy suggestions just a little bit. Shrink the lawn, we talked about some, removing invasive species. So that gets back to what Pat was saying about what you leave and what you take out and how and why you might do that. And I have a lot of invasive species on the property that my husband and I have here. It's 9 acres. And we have a lot of multiflora rose, which is classified as an invasive species in Maine. However, there are worse invasives than multiflora rose, but it will take over. And you'll see it a lot if you're driving around in fields that are no longer used as fields. It's often one of those first big bushes that like kind of goes in and takes over. So I am daunted by it on my property. And the way that I've done it is I've bought rose gloves, number one, so I don't get scratched up. And I put my podcasts on in my pocket, or I get out a radio and an extension cord, and I go stand by one of the big bushes because I still haven't gotten rid of all of them. And I just start cutting back in pieces that then I cut into smaller pieces so I can shove it all into a bag or shove it into, better yet, into my little fireplace where I burn it, because it will root from itself. If it's living material, it has the opportunity that if you put it into a landfill, it could actually just, take over the landfill and then come back to your land sometime in the future. So it's better to burn it. But so it feels daunting if you have a lot of invasives like bittersweet or buckthorn or autumn olive on your property. First of all, there are people in the extension service that will come out and help you identify things and talk to you about potentials to remove. The Soil and Water Conservation District will also do that, like Alita, for example, is in our county. Some of you know her. she will advise. And so that is an important thing to do, and it often can't be done all at once, and it feels daunting, but just remember that every little bit that you do is really, really good and really helpful. And often removing those things, if it's a particularly degraded site, removing those things will actually just give the seed bank that is already there, that has natives in it, an opportunity to potentially repopulate. You also have to be on the lookout for little baby invasive plants coming up. So that's number 2 on his list, removing invasives. We currently have 3,300 invasive species in North America. And often there's a lot of conversation around them. And I understand this conversation because I grow plants that are not native to my property. And some of them are strong seeders, and they are adding to the seed bank. And a lot of things that people think are native are actually not native. For example, coneflower is not native to Maine. However, it is establishing very well here. So are bachelor buttons. So we love bachelor buttons. They're wonderful. They are establishing gradually in New England. Eventually, they might be like Queen Anne's lace, also not native. So there's native, there's invasive, and then there's a lot of things in between. And I think the conversations around all of this are interesting. I think that I do not, I'm not a native only person. I don't know if I want to say anything else more about that, because I don't want to totally go down that rabbit hole, but it is something to think about. What are you planting? Why are you planting it? Can you take responsibility for it? Like, are you planting something that you love because your grandmother grew it and you are going to control it in your landscape? What happens if you leave that landscape? Are you leaving a problem for somebody else? What happens if, just questions like that. I think it's important for all of us as gardeners to ask those questions. And then I think there might be a different answer for each one of us. And this is a big part of discussions now in the United States, because there is a very strong growing native plant interest. One of the Facebook pages I belong to 2 years ago when I started on it, it's like Native Plants of the Northeast or Native Plants of New England or something. It had, 1,000 followers, and now it has 21,000 followers. I mean, it's bonkers. So having these discussions is important, and thinking about it. And I'm not sure if I have an absolute rule about things, but I know I'm not going to plant Japanese knotweed. That's for sure. So the next thing on his list is plant keystone genera, which we spoke about. And being generous with your planting is number 4. And of course, who doesn't want that? We want more flowers and plants because we're gardeners. Starting things from seed is a great way to do that if you're on a budget. And there's so much information on the web now to do that. Plus places like me and other small nurseries, like I am willing, if somebody has a big project and they want 50 plugs, which are basically baby plants of something, which is a tray, 32 or 50, I'm happy to go to a wholesaler and order that for somebody for a slight upcharge of like $10 a tray. So you get the value, you get to be able to do something more significant than if you are just going to a nursery and buying mature gallon-sized plants. Plus, often nurseries that sell larger stock do not sell some of these native plants that people are trying to get a hold of. And they tend to settle into the ground better if they're smaller. So it's less of that sort of idea about we want a beautiful landscape, but it takes a little bit longer to get there when you're using native plants. Yes, Mary.
At the end of this discussion, I'm going to go over some of our smaller nurseries, and I'll be giving you guys a list. And but when I called Sharon Turner to just get her updated info, she said, she made the comment that the smaller independent nurseries are less likely to have those nicotinoids on their plants. And I want-
Neonicotinoids.
Neonicotinoid, yeah, that. And so why is that? Why do the bigger box people, why do they need to put that on the plant? Is it because it's not diverse and they're growing so much Monarda, they got to put that bad stuff on it, whereas the smaller nursery people only have 50 plants and they can control the bad things that happen? Or do you disagree with what she said?
So I don't know. I don't disagree or agree with what she said, but I can tell you from my own personal experience, there are large growers like North Creek and New Moon that have pledged that they do not use neonicotinoids. Pizzo Native is also a large wholesale grower that does not use them. I do not buy from nurseries that use neonicotinoids, and I don't use anything like that on my plants. They are, for those that you don't know, they are systemic insecticides. And what happens is they are persistent in the plant and the plant parts. And therefore, if you go to a place like Home Depot, who is often buying from ginormous, basically, we could say monoculture type nursery situations where they're growing acres and acres, or often under there, it's either completely indoor heated greenhouse situations where often insect infestation can get out of control really quickly because it's in an enclosed environment. And therefore, let's say you have an aphid outbreak, unless you're actively putting ladybirds into that situation, nothing's eating those aphids. So they're just there and they need to get rid of them as quickly as possible. Hold on, Pat, let me just finish my thought and then I'll let you chime in. So the issue around systemic pesticides is that when nectar is taken from the flowers of those plants, the bee is also being exposed to the pesticide. And when insects lay their eggs on the plant, the larvae is being exposed to the pesticide. So therefore, what you're getting is maybe you are trying to kill something you consider bad, right? It's a little bit of a value judgment. It's bad because it's eating the plant. But the problem is that we need things to be eating the plant. However, it's really hard in a situation to sell a plant to somebody that has insect holes in it. They are upset by that. They don't like it. So that is, I mean, I think that's answering your question, right? So smaller nurseries that have an ethical approach and are interested in native plants, like I say to people, this plant should look better in your landscape than it does in this pot that I have shoved it into, right? I am not growing it so that it looks retail ready and like amazingly bonkers, like it's on steroids, blooming its head off, right? I'm growing something that will last in the landscape over a long period of time. So I think smaller growers are more invested in that and more invested in biodiversity. And then people like me that have chosen a low input approach are also invested in that. I don't want to spend money on any of that stuff. Not only is it bad for the environment, I am trying to keep my prices as low as possible so that more people will plant these plants. So Pat, what did you want to say?
I just wanted to say that I believe that both Lowe's, Home Depot, and possibly even Walmart have pledged to stop using neonicotinoids and buying from places that are doing that. Though I'm not advocating buying from them, I'm just saying that I personally prefer Astrid's approach because it has a much lower impact. She's buying stuff small and selling locally, so all of the transportation costs for things are reduced. A lot of that stuff's coming from Canada and it's being transported on trucks and so I think buying locally is the best thing from small growers. But you can't always get what you want. I think the problem places are more like the intermediate size greenhouses that, you know, so places like Plants Unlimited. So every time I go to a place like that, I ask them, because the more people that ask them, the more conscious they are that the people who are buying the plants are concerned about this.
Yeah, Barb, first of all, thank you, Pat. All of that, I want to follow up on a couple things, but I want to hear what Barb wanted to say.
Thank you. I was just going to remind everybody that this is the issue that Corliss and Marge have brought up at past meetings. There's legislation out there right now to ban the use of these pesticides in residential settings, and there's a debate going on about whether it should also apply to the commercial applicators as well as the residential. So I will just restate that if you wanted to write your legislators, now is the time to do it, to get them to support LD 155 as written. And you'll find the testimony that we all submitted out on the website if you need some background or details or anything like that. It only takes a couple lines into your legislator. Our legislators in Belfast and Montville are co-sponsors, our representatives, but not our senators. So I think, Marge, isn't it Chip Curry who's our senator?
Yeah, and Dodge, Ann Dodge is the one who, she brought that up as one of her, she was sponsoring it, I think,
Right,
along with
Jan
someone else. I can't.
Ziegler in Montville. Jan and
Yep.
Paige Ziegler. Yeah,
It is
so
our
Awesome, great. I mean, yeah, it's an important issue. And so I want to get back to what Pat was saying about the pledge, the big box store pledge. And I think that that's great. I think there are other issues around a kind of, well, the bigger things get, the more problematic they become. Large farms versus small farms, lots of shipping involved, monoculture versus biodiversity, right? So it's not only about neonicotinoids. That is a very, very important thing. And hopefully everyone will stop using them soon and relying on them. But there's another, it's not, so number 9 in Talmy's list is do not spray pesticides and fungicides, etc. But there's another thing, a different kind of input, which is do not over fertilize or avoid fertilizer. So that's 9 together. Those two things come together, and this gets to the issue of inputs and what we do and why we do it. So if you go to a place like Lowe's or Home Depot, or if you go to what's that place next to Hannaford's? Job lot, right? Often in the summer, there's a lot of plants outside Job Lot, and it's really tempting. They're often flowering beautifully, and they're often very inexpensive. I get that. But you have no clue where those plants came from and what is on them. And there's a big discussion right now in the floral industry around buying local flowers for this very same reason. In other words, when you are in a situation where you can talk to the person who is growing the plant, you can see where the plant is grown, you know that the carbon footprint to get the plant to you is low, you know that the carbon footprint or other kinds of inputs like insecticides, pesticides, and even fertilization is low. Most of the fertilization that we do to plants is unnecessary, and much of it is actually not taken up by the plant, but goes into our watershed, which is hugely problematic as well. So I am an advocate for, well, we could say lazy, right? Maybe I'm a lazy gardener. I'm not really. I'm a hardworking gardener, but I like to use my energy to grow more plants. I'm not really interested in vacuuming outdoors, and I'm not really interested in fertilizing or doing things that I don't need to do. And the less that we do, actually, the better it is for the environment. I mean, I kind of vote for that, like just in general, like maybe we could just do less all the time, just sit around and look at stuff and enjoy it and stop doing things. Because when we do things, we're often adding a lot of problematics to our environment. But so what I like about that Talmy pairing those two things together is it brings up the issue of inputs in general and how even our own energy, right? The issue of sustainability for our own selves as persons with limited energy and limited time is a valid question in how we're going to garden and how we're going to relate to the rest of the natural world. Any thoughts? Anyone want to add any thoughts to that? Or I could move on to number 5. We talked about this one a little bit too. It's plant for specialists, and I used the example of the milkweed. Now, number 6 is something that we all do because we belong to the garden club together, or I think most of us do, and that's network with our neighbors. And what might that mean? Well, first of all, you might be doing something different from your neighbor and your yard looks different, and you might feel self-conscious about that, or you might feel like they are judging you. So education goes a long way. There's a lot of different signs that people put up in their yard, like describing what's happening, like I'm leaving this hedgerow this way because it is good for this or that. So that's one way to educate people. Another way is to really just plant in a beautiful, amazing yard that's just filled with flowers and filled with insects. And some people are going to be attracted to that. Other types of education are, let's say that you live in an area where there are a lot of fenced in yards, for example. One problem with fenced in yards for animals is it's really hard for them to move from one space to another. And so even just agreeing, everyone in the neighborhood agreeing to do basically what amounts to a little animal door cut into part of your fence down low. So they do this for hedgehogs in Britain, in like London and places, that are very populated with people, and a lot of little tiny yards are all strung together. And that allows animals like hedgehogs or other types of animals that can't get over fences to roam around. So also it's things like this. For example, you may have a yard where you're like, Astrid, I can't build a pond. I don't even want a water feature. Well, but maybe it's okay because maybe the person next to you already has a nice pond, right? And so therefore they're adding something to that space, and you're going to add something else in your yard to that space. Other issues that can come up are people worried about messy landscapes, right? So it's a little bit like I live in the country, and so nobody really cares what I do. I can be as messy as I want. But if you're in certain places, or you yourself appreciate a kind of ordered feeling in your landscape, and I actually like some of that myself. If you can find areas of your yard where you can move debris or create little piles of wood that are out of the way, on the edges, on the margins, you can really do a lot to help other creatures feel more welcome in your yard. So one thing that I recommend to people, and that I think of myself, is edges. If I have paths and edges that are clean and clear and that look intentional, it makes my whole landscape look intentional. So there are little tricks to do it and still have the kind of look that you want. Even a look that is quite, what would we say, like not cottage garden, like Mary was talking about, the modern cottage garden, but more like more pattern based, like more designed, like more specifically designed. You can have a landscape like that with a very high biodiversity value. You just have to make certain choices about what you're doing, and one of them is leaving as much debris as possible on your landscape somewhere. So that's 6, networking with neighbors. 7 is revamping hardscape. Now, this is a really interesting one because this is for the safety of other creatures that come onto your property. So if you have window wells, often creatures fall into window wells and they can't get out. So you can either cover them over with plexiglass so they don't fall in, or you can put little twigs or something into the window well so they can climb out. Raising your mower height is a big one. So leaving your grass just a little bit longer so that critters that are running around on the lawn don't get, chopped up by the mower blades. Turn off lights at night or use motion sensors. Darkness is really, really important. It's actually important for us too. You should all be turning off your computer 2 hours before you go to bed. If you're going to buy bee hotels, buy more of them, smaller, and put them in different parts of your property. Because what they're finding is when people make or buy a big bee hotel and they put it in a spot, it's pretty much a smorgasbord for every wasp that eats bees to just come and kill them all at the same time, right? So, so disperse those bee hotels. Or if you are leaving debris in certain discrete areas, you don't really need bee hotels. They have all the materials they need to do their own thing. Put a bell on your cat or keep your cat indoors. And window safety for birds. Now, he doesn't list either of those things in his book, maybe because putting a bell on your cat or leaving your cat indoors is kind of controversial, but it's something to think about. Birds are eaten by cats. Okay, so number 8 is caterpillar pupation under trees. Now, this is something that I had not thought. This is one of the things that I definitely learned from this book. So under trees, especially in urban and suburban environments, there's often just compacted grass. And what happens is part of a pupation cycle is often not in the tree where the egg is laid, but in the ground under the tree. So caterpillars drop down and then they're trying to burrow their way into this hard pan of grass under trees. So thinking about the canopy of the tree and the opportunity that can afford, one thing is you just decide to leave the leaves there. It starts to make its own little ecosystem. Lots of good little hyphae of fungus start to develop in that leaf pile, and they talk to the tree and they talk to everyone else, and it just starts to make a better spot under the tree just by leaving the leaves. But maybe you don't want to do that. It is an opportunity for planting, in particular, especially if the tree isn't a shallow rooted type of tree. You can, and if you plant plants really small, they'll find their way to coexist with the roots of the tree. So a lot of, again, we get back to those dry shade ground covers as being very useful in those situations. And then this just creates a better environment for that pupal stage of the larvae to exist on your landscape. So if you have a bunch of trees and a bunch of shrubs, but then you have interrupted the life cycle of the insect by not providing that ground that they can get into, then it's not as useful as it could be. So I see for me, those are planting opportunities, or excuses not to rake. It's great. So that is fascinating to me and something that I had not considered at all. And then 9, we talked about don't spray pesticides, fungicides, and avoid fertilization. And then 10 is that piece that Barb and Marge were talking about as far as involving institutions, making demands for change at an institutional level. And that could be citywide, that could be countywide, statewide, federal, right? So that is also very important. We're all voters. We have expectations, we pay taxes, and we get to have a say in how our money is used. And those people need to answer to us. Those institutions, they need to answer to us. So don't give up. It seems very daunting sometimes, but don't give up challenging those institutions and trying to make change at that level. But if you feel frustrated, just go plant something in the ground, because that's something you can do right away.
Did you want to talk about the two Judith Schwartz books just as?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I see it's 11 o'clock, Mary. Do you want to, I will just very quickly talk about them. So what I have found is that these two books, which we brought into the library, they're by the same woman, Judith Schwartz. And what she does is she travels around the world interviewing people and writing about them, and they're all involved in problem solving around ecology. So problem solving around clean water, problem solving around desertification, doing research about now that we have kind of gotten rid of a lot of we've extirpated a lot of our larger animals, and what people are realizing is that instead of fencing off larger animals from ecosystems, it's actually really better to include them. They're a significant part of the ecology, because they roam around and they scuff up the ground and they poop on the ground and they nibble off plants, and they do a lot of things that actually make the ecology function more robustly. So when I'm out in my own garden, I often think I'm the biggest animal out here right now. So what am I going to do that is kind of like that in my own landscape to help move things along? And often, for example, I really like self-seeders. And in order to have self-seeders work really well, you have to disturb the ground, because they're often ruderal species, meaning they take over first in disturbed ground, which is why you see them a lot on roadsides like Queen Anne's lace and stuff, right? So I love plants like that. And if I just mulch all the time, or I don't scuff up the ground, then they have a harder time getting a hold and blooming for me every spring and making me really happy. So I like to think about myself as that big animal. I'm not going outside and pooping on the ground, but who knows? Maybe someday I will. But anyway, these two books are really great, and they'll make you really happy, because the creativity of human beings to solve this problem, to solve these problems that we have also created, is amazing. It's just amazing. Okay, I'm going to shut up now.
Okay, so we're just going to wrap up. I want to tell you guys to look in your email for a list of smaller nurseries that I found, and some of them you might know and some that you don't. I just want to shout out. We obviously, Astrid is our #1 go-to small nursery place. She gives so much to the club, but there's an older gentleman in Belfast, Ron Dow, that will divide hostas on his property. Now, hostas may not be the best plant for you to grow for biodiversity.
You can eat them.
Yeah, you can eat them, so they're good for you. And Astrid's always reminding me, like, that 70%, my hostas will make up the other 30% of my yard. Sharon Turner has a new thing going on out in Washington, where she set up a picnic table next to Crystal Lake, where she has her farm. She farms there with her son, and is a big supplier to the Knox Lincoln sale of native shrubs. So that's something new this year that she's doing. She's inviting people to bring a picnic and sit out by her lake, and also, buy some plants from her. Windswept Gardens in Bangor on April 10th is having a mini little flower show. So if one of the fun things you like to do every year is haunt the retail section at the Portland Flower Show, they're going to have a lot of those vendors are going to be at Windswept in Bangor. Succulents, sun catchers, metal garden signs, glass flowers. So that might be something to put on your calendar. I found when I was doing this research that there's a bonsai nursery in Verona Island. And I assume those are indoor plants, but it's something that I want to check out that's unusual. And you'll see that name on this list. I also found a rose nursery that I had actually asked Allison Beards where to go and she didn't know. So now I'm going to send this list to Allison. Out in Alfred, there's rose growers who have been out there for 50 years doing this. And they sell roses on their own roots. So they're hardy to main and they've been growing there for 50 years. So that was fun to find. And then in Winterport, there's a relatively new nursery for fruit trees and berry shrubs, grapes, walnuts, unusual, hard to find varieties. So I'll be looking them up as well. I just think that this is going to be fun because all during COVID, we're like, I want to get out of town, but where to go? And, you know, you can't, it's too icy to hike or whatever. So I feel like now, I've never been to Alfred. I can get out there and see what's going on. Chelsea, there's a daylily garden nursery out there. So I hope that you guys do some road trips this summer and maybe report back next winter what you found. So that wraps up the 2021 session of Weeders and Readers. Yeah.
You got a couple questions here from Pat and Barb, or comments.
I just want to make a pitch for Wild Seeds, the Wild Seed Group in Portland. That's a good source for native seeds. And also Maine Audubon's has a plant sale of native plants, which is a fundraiser for them. And so does Wild Gardens of Acadia. I went to their plant sale last year and found some really unusual things. I think that's in the first week of June. But anyway, those are things that I've done, and but Astrid's my main person.
Well, thank you, but no, those are good. And Wild Seed Project is going to be starting their own nursery. I don't know if all of you know that, but they're going to be growing a lot more native plants, not just providing seed. And part of that is people are learning that sometimes it's hard to grow native plants from seed. Who knew? And frustrating. And there is such a high demand for straight species that are native to Maine. So it's exciting that they're doing that. I mean, I'm a little bit daunted by it because, you know, they're a nonprofit, but I'm hoping they'll be good collaborators, not just competition. Hey, Barb, what did you want to say?
Thanks. As co-chair of the plant sale, I'd just like to ask if you do go out to these nurseries, some of these already contribute to the plant sale. So if you do go out, ask them if they do, thank them if they say yes, and ask them if they want to participate this year if they say no, and then shoot me an email. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Anything else? Any other comments anyone want to offer before we go?
Good. This was very nice.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Hey, bye everyone. Happy
Bye.
gardening.
Thanks so much. See you.
Thank
See
you.
everybody.
Thank you.